Welcome back. We're looking at the 2009 World Conference Against Racism, nicknamed Durban 2. From London, I'm joined by Massoud Shadjareh, chair of the Islamic Human Rights Commission. He supports the Durban 2 process. Here in New York, I'm joined by the executive director of UN Watch, Hillel Neuer. He believes that Durban 2 is already on the wrong track. Now, before the break, we had a call from Hans in Paris, and I'll get to your question in just a second, Hans, but let's get Faisal on the line from Malaysia. Faisal, what would you like to ask?
Well, I would like to ask the two gentlemen, and I'm sure Mr. Massoud is more aware of it. First of all, I would like to introduce myself. I'm actually a staunch supporter of the U.S. Changes of bringing democracy in Iraq. Yet I must say, since 9/11, I am a bit appalled by the kind of mass retribution against Muslims, especially British of Middle Eastern origin, the treatment they do get in the U.S. airports, and even British airports, in Western airports. I mean, for goodness sake, it seems to me I myself had a very bad experience, and if this is a bad experience in one of the British airports, and I'm sure Mr. Massoud comes on the daily issues, and if we do not tackle this issue, then we do really have a serious...
Faisal? Faisal, I'm going to put this to Massoud. I'm going to put this to Massoud Shadjareh in London. Does the issue of the way Muslims are being treated around the world, which of course has changed since that last meeting in 2001, do you feel that is something for the agenda that comes up high on the list somewhere?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I think the issue of rise of Islamophobia has been something that has been devastating. I mean, since 9/11, we have seen erosion of civil liberties and, unfortunately, profiling. What is happening in airports in United States and Britain, it is unacceptable. I mean, we've got people being stopped. They got the right of questioning them up to 9 hours, and they have to answer every question. And if they don't, they get 3 months imprisonment. And the sort of question that are being asked in airports in Britain include which mosque you go to and which political party did you voted for, which is ludicrous. It's nothing to do with terrorism, and I don't know which political party is more likely for one to become terrorist. Or indeed in the United States, we've got similar situation. I myself, going to visit my mother, who is an American citizen, I was stopped for over 3.5 hours for questions which really was totally absurd and embarrassing to some extent. I think we need to address this. We also need to address the issue of Darfur.
Massoud, a question for you. At what point, where does this threshold come where you don't mix politics with the issue of racism, or do you feel they are inextricably linked? I mean, can you deal with basic levels of issues about racism without having to go into the politics that seem to complicate what is racism and what is a political judgment?
Well, I think, I mean, unfortunately, you can't really deal with the problem of racism without going through the political process, and the political will needs to be there. And when you see that there is no political will to address certain aspects of racism, and indeed people using politics of fear, be it in sort of Israel or be it in the rest of the world on the anti-terror situation, we actually have got a combat in our hand, and we really need to move forward. We need to create consensus, and we need to put pressure on people. I mean, you know, we were talking about UN and my colleague in United States was talking about the incompetence of UN. But let me give you another figure of the incompetence of UN. There has been 65 UN resolutions against the state of Israel, not a single one against Palestine, but none of them have come to any fruit. We've got the situation that United States is actually vetoing every aspect that United Nations criticized the state of Israel. Now, we can move forward on those areas, so we need to go into masses.
Listen. Massoud, I want to check. I mean, the thing is, I don't want the debate to go just onto this Israel-Palestinian issue, because, of course, the whole point of Durban is it got stuck last time on that, and I want to see if it goes a bit broader than that this time. But I do want to get to Hillel Neuer and ask about the question that Hans in Paris raised, and he was questioning how much. I mean, when you look at racial equality in America, it's not been that long. You know, that you have some real sense of some moves towards racial equality, and people say that Katrina was an example of there not being racial equality. So his question was, you know, how can you look at America's sense of values if you look at, for example, the issue of racism in America and how equality is a recent feature or approach. And then the issue of, again, they brought up the issue of Saddam Hussein, you know, friend or foe, that there's double standards sometimes when people can switch from being friend to foe.
Well, look, I think the United States still has a far way to go on racism, but, you know, if I think of what our founder was doing in the 1960s when he won the case of Gray versus Saunders, one man, one vote, where black people didn't have the right to vote in the U.S. South, and today where Barack Obama is a serious contender for the presidency. I mean, I think we all have to recognize that there have been huge strides made in the fight against racism, but still a great deal, you know, needs to be done. I think the problem here, and one of your callers mentioned about how Muslims who are being discriminated against. You know, there's so many real issues about people who are being discriminated against, and what a tragedy it was when I was sitting there in Geneva in August 2007, and when the Durban II planning conference began, the first thing they did was elect Libya as chair. We cannot forget, Riz, we cannot forget that Libya is a country that scapegoated, tortured savagely a Palestinian doctor and 5 Bulgarian nurses for the crime of being foreigners when there was a tainted blood scandal. We cannot forget that this summer, Libya fully supported Hannibal Gaddafi when he was arrested in Geneva for beating his maid and his servant with a belt and a hanger, you know, who were treated like slaves. When Libya at the Abuja conference, I have to say this, when Libya at the Abuja conference talked about racism and said their priority was to fight against discrimination against maids and servants. So the cynicism here says something about who's running this.
You can't equate one case with the whole country. Just because one person did it, that you can't say that everyone in Libya
fully supported him and convened mass demonstrations and almost went to diplomatic war with Switzerland to support what he did. This is not just a case of one person. They fully stood by this.
Can you find any country that's guilt-free to be head of the conference then?
Well, absolutely not. But to say that everyone is equal, you know, if you look at Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, every UN report, Libya appears at the very bottom, the worst of the worst. When they were elected to be the chair, I think the organizers of Durban made a great mistake. And for those of us in the anti-racism cause, you know, I know that my counterpart in London would like to keep talking about Israel, but it really hurts those victims of racism around the world.
I don't want to talk about the issue of Palestine-Israeli all the time, but the fact of the matter is I do want to include that. I do want to criticize Libya. We do want to talk about Darfur. We do want to talk about those things, but we don't want to have any issue of racism taken off the agenda. Like the issue of what's happening to the Palestinians.
Massoud?
That's not what he did in Durban 2001. He was leading the hateful rhetoric that was condemned by the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mary Robinson, and he was part of the problem that really set back the racism cause.
Let me put an email to you, because again, I don't want to dwell on the Israel-Palestinian issue, but I want to get onto the issue of where does politics mix with racism and perhaps cloud the issue. And this email that came from Maya in Michigan asks this question. By the way, it's a viewer who claims that UN Watch is affiliated with the American Jewish Committee.
It's not a claim, it's a fact, and we're proud of it. It's one of the great NGOs in the United States.
All right. Just as equating Zionism with racism is wrong, doesn't Mr. Neuer and his UN Watch engage in the same flawed reasoning, equating anti-Israeli sentiment with anti-Semitism? Why must we accept that addressing Palestinian human rights abuses at the hands of Israelis is driven by anti-Semitism, as many pro-Israeli groups would have us believe? And again, it's more on the issue of politics. And
well, first of all, I have to respond to that. That's preposterous. You know, our position is that Israel should be held fully accountable in every forum, and obviously in Israel itself, there's a vigorous free press, an independent judiciary, and a vigorous Knesset, as we saw this week. It's the only country in the Middle East where power changes hands peacefully and democratically. And you know, the problem is that Israel is not being addressed in a fair fashion at the Human Rights Council, which fails to deal with, you know, massive abuses of women's rights in Saudi Arabia, you know, prisoners being slaughtered in Syria, massive human rights abuses in Cuba. All of these are systematically ignored. You know, I just met with the independent expert in Liberia. They're canceling the mandate on Liberia. Okay. The only one they want to keep is Israel. That's the problem. Okay. And no one's saying that people who criticize Israel are anti-Semitic, although some of them do use anti-Zionism as a mask for that.
I do have to stop you there only because we're out of time. Hillel Neuer and Massoud Shadjareh, thank you very much for being with us. So much more to debate, but always out of time. Thanks for being with us too. On tomorrow's show, NATO's Secretary General Jaap de Hoop Scheffer joins us to take your questions. So join us for that, and we'll see you next time.